10 weirdest occupations in history. Weird job number 1. The professional mourner, the original drama queen. Imagine this. Your job is to cry at funerals. Not your own tears, of course. Those are reserved for your paycheck. If you've ever been told you're too dramatic, here's a profession that would have paid you for it. These mourners didn't just cry. They wailed, they howled. They made sure the entire village knew someone had died. Think of it as the ancient version of a Facebook status update, but much louder. Some mourners had such a reputation for their crying skills that they were booked months in advance. If you had the biggest lungs in town, you could cry yourself all the way to the bank. They would even rip their clothes and cover themselves in ash, ensuring their performance was award-worthy. Oscar nominations? Please. These folks were aiming for best in sobbing at the local funeral awards. If you were a good mourner, you'd be tipped extra for more tears. The tear economy was booming. The wetter your face, the fatter your purse. There were actually schools for mourning. Imagine being taught how to bawl better by the teacher who's top of the class in emotional breakdowns. Some mourners added singing to their crying. It's like being at an opera, but instead of applause, people handed you tissues. And let's not forget that professional mourners often had rivals. If you heard louder cries at the neighbor's funeral, you'd better believe there was a mourning showdown. Funerals were sometimes delayed just so the top mourners could clear their schedule. Sorry, can't die today. The top crier is fully booked until Thursday. While it sounds like a sad job, it was actually a pretty sweet gig. Crying for a living? Sounds better than doing it for free. Weird job number 2. The royal food taster. Risky business for the hungry. Imagine being hired to eat. Sounds like a dream, right? Now add the possibility of sudden death. Welcome to the world of the royal food taster. These brave souls ate every meal with the side of fear, knowing that one bad bite could lead to a very permanent retirement plan. Your job was to taste the king's food to ensure it wasn't poisoned. But if you ever refused to eat, that's when the king got suspicious. Talk about a lose-lose situation. The real kicker? You weren't allowed to show fear. If you hesitated, the king might think you were the poisoner. So, every meal had to be treated like the best thing you'd ever eaten. A bonus of the job? You got to eat the finest food in the land. The downside? The finest food might also be your last supper. Food tasters needed a strong stomach, not just for gourmet dishes, but also for the anxiety. It was like living in a never-ending episode of Fear Factor. Some food tasters got clever, bringing along food tasting assistants. If the assistant dropped dead, well, then it was time to order pizza. Royal chefs weren't always happy about tasters. After all, one bad taste test could end their culinary career in a heartbeat. Occasionally, tasters would fake an illness just to see if anyone would confess to poisoning the dish. It's not paranoia if the palace is really out to get you. If you survived long enough, you could retire with stories that made you the ultimate party guest. Did I ever tell you about the time I almost died eating a chicken leg? Weird job number 3. The Gong farmer. No, it's not what you think, it's worse. If you thought your job stinks, be grateful you weren't a Gong farmer. Spoiler alert, they weren't farming anything you'd want to eat. Gong farmers were responsible for cleaning out the latrines, privies, and cesspits. Basically, they were medieval plumbers, but without the luxury of modern tools, or, soap. They worked at night to avoid the daytime crowds. If you met a Gong farmer on the street, you were definitely holding your breath. Fresh air was a luxury they didn't know. The job required a sturdy constitution and a very weak sense of smell. If you ever complained about your job, a Gong farmer would laugh in your face, if they could get close enough. They got paid surprisingly well, though. When your job involves shoveling human waste, you can demand a high salary. Perks of the job? Free fertilizer. It was a job that often ran in families. If your dad was a Gong farmer, guess what? You were probably going to follow in his very smelly footsteps. Gong farmers had to be careful about what they ate, because a stomach ache on the job would make an already unpleasant situation much, much worse. This job was so unpleasant that it was even worse in the summer. Imagine shoveling muck in the blazing heat. Talk about a job where you're always in deep trouble. Despite the stigma, they were necessary for keeping cities somewhat clean. Without them, the streets would have been a lot messier and smellier. Eventually, the job got safer and slightly less gross. With the invention of modern sewage systems, Gong farmers were finally able to retire from the world's least glamorous profession. Weird job number 4. The knocker-up, the human alarm clock. Before alarm clocks, people relied on a professional knocker-up to wake them up. Imagine hiring someone to literally knock on your window with a stick. Now that's a wake-up call. These early risers would stroll the streets at ungodly hours, tapping on windows with long poles. If you needed an extra 5 minutes, too bad. The knocker-up had a schedule to keep. If you were a heavy sleeper, the knocker-up would get creative. Stones, loud shouting, or a horn might do the trick. Nothing says good morning like being startled out of bed by a stranger. The job wasn't just about being early. It required precision. Wake someone up too late, and you'd be out of a job. Too early, and you'd be out of an ear if they got annoyed. The knocker-up would take on multiple clients at once, running from house to house. It was like being an alarm clock, a Fitbit, and a personal trainer all rolled into one. If the knocker-up overslept, the irony was not lost on the clients, who were likely banging on their own windows in frustration. They often carried long, bamboo poles to reach high windows. If your knocker-up was particularly tall, you got the bonus of extra persistence. Payment was collected weekly, which meant the knocker-up had to remember who they had to wake up and when. It's a good thing sleep deprivation didn't make them forgetful. Being a knocker-up meant braving all kinds of weather. Rain, snow, or sleet. Nothing stopped these human alarm clocks from making sure you were on time. This job faded away with the invention of alarm clocks, but if you're ever late, you might wish you had a knocker-up to blame. Weird job number 5. The leech collector. Squeamish need not apply. If you're not a fan of slimy, blood-sucking creatures, you definitely wouldn't have enjoyed being a leech collector. But hey, the medical field needed them, so someone had to do it. Leeches were the hottest medical commodity for centuries. If you could find and collect them, you were basically a doctor's best friend, just a very gross one. The job required wading into swamps and bogs, letting the leeches attach to you, and then carefully removing them. It's like extreme fishing, except you're the bait. Leeches were used for everything from headaches to the plague. If you had a problem, doctors figured a few leeches could suck it right out of you. The cure for all? More leeches. Collectors had to be brave, or just very desperate for money, because the more leeches you collected, the better you got paid. It was a slimy sort of commission-based job. After a long day of leeching, collectors would have to count how many had attached to them. 10 leeches? That's a solid day's work, they'd say, with a slightly paler complexion. Collectors were often covered in scars from repeated bites. If you ever met one, you'd know it from their unique polka-dotted arms and legs. Some leech collectors even started their own leech farms, ensuring a steady supply. It's like being an organic farmer, but much, much grosser. The job fell out of favor when medical science advanced, but leech collectors were still around for a surprisingly long time, even after everyone else figured out they were, well, icky. Nowadays, you'd have to be crazy, or very into medieval cosplay, to want to relive the days of leech collecting. Although, the stories would be unforgettable. Weird job number 6. The rat catcher. Rodent exterminator extraordinaire. Long before pest control companies existed, there were rat catchers. If you had a rodent problem, these brave souls would dive headfirst into the sewers, armed with nothing but a sack and a stick. Rat catchers were often seen as heroes, especially during the plague. Killing rats was a way to protect the city, but it also meant risking their own lives in the process. Some rat catchers used trained dogs or ferrets to help them, turning rodent hunting into a sort of twisted sport. Got rats? Bring in the ferret squad. The job was so dangerous that rat catchers were known to carry antidotes to the various poisons they used. You know, just in case they accidentally poisoned themselves. Rat catchers had to be quick, sneaky, and fearless. If you screamed at the sight of a rodent, this was definitely not the career for you. They were often paid by the rat, meaning the more they caught, the more they earned. So, in a weird way, a rat-infested town was a rat catcher's goldmine. Some rat catchers would even breed their own rats to release them later, ensuring job security. That's right, they were both the problem and the solution. Genius, right? The more daring rat catchers would show off their trophies, hanging dead rats from their belts as a badge of honor. It's like a rat-themed fashion statement. With the advent of better sanitation and public health measures, rat catching became less common, but in some parts of the world, it's still a respected, if gross, profession. If you ever meet an old rat catcher, be sure to ask for stories, just maybe not over dinner. Their tales are sure to be as thrilling as they are stomach-turning. Weird job number 7. The Sin Eater. A meal you'd regret. Ever had a meal you instantly regretted? Now imagine eating a meal knowing it's meant to absolve someone else's sins. Welcome to the world of the Sin Eater. Sin Eaters were hired to eat a ritual meal over a corpse to symbolically take on the deceased's sins. Talk about a heavy meal, spiritually at least. The job was considered both essential and reviled. You were paid to eat, but also to take on the sins of others. It's like being a trash collector for souls. Sin Eaters were often outcasts, doing a job no one else wanted. But hey, at least they got a free meal out of it, right? Even if it came with a side of eternal damnation. The food wasn't anything fancy, bread, cheese, ale, but it was enough to supposedly absorb all those pesky sins. You had to hope the deceased wasn't too sinful, or you'd need a second helping. People believed that without a Sin Eater, the dead would be stuck in limbo. So these folks were pretty crucial. No pressure, though, just the fate of a soul on your plate. Sin Eaters had to be strong-willed, as they were often shunned by society. It's not easy making friends when your job is to eat the sins of the dead. Some Sin Eaters had a good gig going, with families paying extra for a thorough job. More sins? More bread. It's a carb-heavy profession. This practice faded out with the rise of different religious practices, but the idea of eating sins was just one of many strange ways people dealt with death. If you ever find yourself feeling guilty after a big meal, just remember, it could be worse. You could be eating someone else's sins for dessert. Weird job number 8. The cat meat seller. Persistent salesperson. In Victorian England, the streets were prowled by cat meat sellers. That's right, these vendors sold meat specifically for cats. Who knew felines were such a lucrative market? The job required walking the streets, calling out to cats and their owners, and offering up a selection of fresh meat. It's like being a door-to-door salesman, but for cats. If you thought cats were picky eaters today, imagine trying to sell them meat in the 19th century. Come on, Fluffy, just one bite. I promise it's the good stuff. Cat meat sellers had to source their products carefully. No one wanted their cat eating questionable meat, so sellers had to be reputable. It's like being a butcher, but for the aristocrats. Some sellers would even dress up their meat stalls to attract customers. After all, presentation is key when selling to discerning feline clientele. The job was seasonal, with winter being the busiest time. Cold weather meant more indoor cats, and indoor cats meant more sales. Cat owners knew their pets deserved the best. A successful cat meat seller needed to be persuasive, charming, and a little bit cat-obsessed. PSSSD, wanna buy some premium kitty snacks? It's fresh, I promise. They also had to be quick on their feet, literally. Cats can be elusive, so a cat meat seller needed the agility to keep up with their fast-moving customers. The job died out with the advent of mass-produced pet food, but back in the day, being a cat meat seller meant you had a steady, if slightly odd, income. Next time you feed your cat, just think. Somewhere, a Victorian cat meat seller is smiling, knowing their legacy lives on in your kitty's dinner. Weird job number 9. The Alchemist, the original get-rich-quick job. Alchemy was the ultimate hustle. You could turn lead into gold, discover the elixir of life. Or at least that's what alchemists claimed. It was medieval science meets fantasy. Alchemists were part scientist, part wizard, and 100% trying to get rich. If you had a cauldron and a dream, you were halfway there. The quest to turn base metals into gold was known as the magnum opus. It's like today's get-rich-quick schemes, but with more explosions. Alchemists dabbled in all sorts of weird experiments, from trying to create homunculi, tiny artificial humans, to concocting potions that could cure anything, except their own debt. They were often funded by wealthy patrons who hoped to cash in on their success. No pressure, just the expectations of an entire kingdom on your shoulders. Alchemy wasn't just about gold. It was also about immortality. Some alchemists claimed to have discovered the secret to eternal life. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out. Despite their failures, alchemists contributed to modern chemistry. After all, if you try to turn lead into gold for centuries, you're bound to discover something useful. Alchemists were often secretive, guarding their recipes closely. If someone figured out your gold-making trick, you'd be out of a job, and possibly out of gold. The search for the Philosopher's Stone, a substance that could grant eternal life and infinite wealth, was the holy grail of alchemy. And just like the grail, it was never found. Today, we might laugh at alchemists, but back then, they were the ultimate dreamers. If you could imagine it, you could alchemize it. Or at least try. Weird job number 10. The whipping boy, taking one for the team. Imagine getting punished for someone else's mistakes. That was the life of a whipping boy, a kid who got whipped every time the royal heir misbehaved. Royalty has its perks, unless you're the whipping boy. Whipping boys were typically the same age as the prince they served. Their main job? Stand there and take a beating whenever the prince acted out. Talk about a rough childhood. The idea was that the prince would feel bad about his friend being whipped, but let's be honest, royal kids weren't exactly known for their empathy. Whipping boys lived in the palace, so they got all the benefits of royal life, minus the whole being whipped thing. Silver lining? Free room and board. Some princes actually grew close to their whipping boys, making them lifelong friends. Nothing bonds you like shared trauma, especially if you're the one dishing it out. If a prince was particularly naughty, the whipping boy had a very tough day at the office. Being the royal scapegoat wasn't exactly a dream job. Whipping boys were chosen from noble families, so at least they had some status, right up until they had to take a beating for someone else's bad behavior. The role was eventually phased out as ideas about punishment and education changed. Thank goodness, because take a beating for the prince doesn't look great on a resume. Despite the hardships, some whipping boys managed to leverage their royal connections into better careers later in life. Hey, remember me? The kid who got whipped for you? How about a job? The whipping boy is a reminder that even in the past, someone was always getting the short end of the stick, literally. And that's it from this video. See you in the next one.